Terry. I couldn't believe what had just happened. Helen, my wife of 24 years with me, had just left home to spend the weekend having fun with one of her partners, Ray Bland. She never once said she still loved me or claimed it was just fun. She didn't even kiss me on the cheek when she left, just stroked my head like stroking a dog. Damn it, how much colder could she be? And what's next? I shuddered, contemplating my options. I suppose I should backtrack a bit and explain. We were each 22 years old when we got married 24 years ago. I had just finished my degree in information technology and was starting a new job. Helen continued her education and eventually earned her Juris Doctor degree. I supported her through those difficult years and did so gladly. She was my soulmate, the love of my life. And I knew that the support I gave her then would benefit us both in the long run. So I saved and saved and saved and did everything I could to make her life easier. She graduated and was hired at a prestigious law firm. Over the years, she developed a reputation as a tough lawyer who won most of the cases she worked on. She made more money than me, but I didn't care. I was proud of her accomplishments. We talked about kids and agreed to hold off so she could develop her career. In the end, she made it clear she didn't want to commit to children, and we didn't have any. I guess we could be called dinces. Dual income? No kids? I didn't even know what birth control she was using. How pathetic was that? Even if I had managed to get pregnant with her, I was sure she would have just terminated the pregnancy, or maybe she wouldn't even tell me about it. Youth be told, deep down I resented her, but I tried my best to accept it and enjoy life. Although I would have loved to have a child to pass on my inheritance, I was glad we had no children now. Helen had always been the dominant partner in our marriage. That was fine with me, as I liked to put her needs before my own. It had worked well so far as she had always respected me, or at least seemed to. Really, however, her attitude has changed. Perhaps it has to do with hormonal changes. Her appetite and desire had increased significantly over the past few months. I didn't mind, as I was the fortunate recipient of her increased libido. Last night, however, she dropped her bombshell. I'm going on a date with Ray Bland tomorrow night. Dinner, dancing, entertainment at the hotel. I'll be back to see you maybe Sunday. She told me without the slightest sense of guilt. She might as well have told me she was taking the car in for an oil change. What? Why? I asked dumbly. Aren't I enough? I've been enough all these years, right? Right, she agreed. But now I'm in that phase where no guy will ever be enough. You and I are still going to have fun. I just need new ones to get it out in the open. I knew it was pointless to argue with her. She had made up her mind and expected me to just agree to be her willing cuckold, like I had agreed to so many other things in the past. A cold emptiness formed in my chest where my heart should have been, and I shuddered at the thought of the pain to come. I didn't say anything, just showered and went back to bed, not bothering to kiss her goodnight. Nor did I say anything to her the next morning when we were getting ready for work. For the first time in 24 years, I didn't even kiss her goodbye or tell her I loved her. I'm not sure if that was even on her mind, but I didn't care. She was already dead to me. That day at work, I was practically a walking zombie. All I could think about was what Helen planned to do to me that night. I'd read enough stories online to know what to expect. Chastity cages, cleaning up after my lover, being forced to look at them in our marital bed. There was no way I was going to put up with all that crap. I also knew what could await me in the event of a divorce. In a nutshell, I would be the loser, and she would get the lion's share of everything. Screw it, I thought. There was no point in arguing with Helen either. I knew her well enough to realize that arguing would only cause her to dig herself even deeper into the ground. And there didn't seem to be any way to just run away. If she'd told me about her plan a month, hell, even a couple weeks ago, I could probably just clear the air, leave my ring, and walk away. Good at people can get a job anywhere, and I knew I was good. But with such short notice, I felt completely trapped. There was only one way to handle this, I thought. Someone had to die. When I got home that evening, she didn't say anything, and was just getting ready for her date for the weekend. While she showered and dressed, I pulled a .45 caliber M1 911 A1 pistol out of my briefcase and loaded it with a full magazine. My plan was simple. When Ray came to the door, I would shoot him. Hopefully, Helen would see it happen. I knew I would end up in jail probably for the rest of my life, but I didn't care. But that didn't happen. When Ray pulled up to our driveway in his Maserati, he just honked. The cowardly bastard didn't even have the guts to come to the door. Helen patted me on the head like a dog on her way out. She didn't notice the loaded gun I had hidden under a pillow on the couch beside me. I didn't say anything, only growled as she walked out the door with her overnight bag. I truly hated myself then, but I recognized that even though what she was doing to me, to us, I couldn't shoot her. And running out the door, spraying bullets into a receding car seemed, I don't know, like a bad movie. When they left, I grabbed my laptop. I thought about our life together for a long time. Looking through my photo gallery, I remembered our vacations to Cancun and Paris and the Caribbean cruise for our 10th anniversary. We both looked so happy in the photos. None of that meant anything to me now. Unlike Helen, I had no real support system, no family or friends I could count on in times of need. My sister died young, and my brother died during a stupid fraternity initiation. My father died a few years ago. Helen sent me to the funeral alone, saying she hated funerals and had 2 important things to do that couldn't wait. After my dad died, my mom's condition deteriorated rapidly, but she lived on her own until she died just 2 years ago. Before she died, I called her once a month and sent her cards at appropriate times, as I knew Helen wouldn't think twice about it. Mom took it hard when it became apparent that she would never have grandchildren to spoil. I ended up attending her funeral alone. Again, I also had a crazy uncle who moved to the Australian outback over a decade ago, and I never heard of him, although my mom occasionally brought him up in conversation. There were people I worked with and befriended, but there was no one I would call a close friend, someone I could confide in, have a drink with after work, play a game, or go fishing. I half-heartedly cursed myself for building my world around my goofy wife. Sam, I logged into our joint bank account and made some changes. Helen, like me, had her own account. We'd made that arrangement when we first got married, and she had her own credit card. Then I went to her law firm's website. I sent a letter to every address I could find on the firm's website, including her managing partner, explaining what she and Ray had done. I realized that they probably wouldn't see the letter until Monday, but that was fine with me. I then printed out a short note to Helen, which I placed on the coffee table under my wedding ring. I turned off my laptop and returned it to its case, then sat down on the couch, mentally reminiscing about better times. It took me a while to work up the courage, and I wished I'd found it sooner. But finally, I picked up the gun and put the end of it to my head. "I'm sorry, Mom and Dad. I hope to see you soon," I mumbled before pulling the trigger. Helen, I was lying on the bed, along with Ray. Sam, I hadn't thought about Terry at all since I left the house on Friday, and I wasn't too pleased that Ray was talking about him like that, but he was right. There was a time when Terry could sleep all night long, but those days were far in the past. Sure, Terry had always been warm and loving, but sometimes a girl just needs to be entertained, I thought smugly. To be honest, I didn't think about him at all this weekend, I said. You put him out of your mind, and don't forget he's a few years older than you, so that's to be expected. Didn't you think about what we discussed earlier? You mean doing it in front of your husband? Asked Ray incredulously, raising an eyebrow skeptically. Yes, I replied, just to remind him how things are going to work from now on. You have nothing to worry about. Terry's a coward. He won't do anything. He didn't even try to stop me when I left the house Friday night. Well, kitties have a way of turning into mountain lions when they're pushed too hard. Remember the Connors case, Ray warned. You said he didn't try to stop you. Did he do or say anything? No, I said. He just sat on the couch. In fact, he hasn't said anything at all since I told him about it Thursday night, I added dismissively. Did he call or text you? Asked Ray incredulously. No, he hasn't called. You don't think that's strange? Not really, I answered him. I've made it clear to him that this is what I need. He knows how I act when I make a decision. Either that or he's already dumped you, Ray replied sharply. He wouldn't dare dump me, I stated with a snort. He knows I love him and it's just sex. Ray looked at me as if he wanted to say, "What's wrong with you?" His expression softened after a few moments as I stared at him. "If you say so," he said, "let's go at it again." "Red, not until you promise me you'll help me punish him when you bring me back tomorrow night," I said. "Okay," Ray agreed. "I'll help you discipline him tomorrow." We pulled into my driveway late Sunday night. The house was quiet, almost too quiet. I looked at the yard and realized it hadn't been mowed. Terry always mowed the yard on Saturdays. I mentally flagged to talk to him. After all, I expected that with my new interest, nothing else would change. "Are you ready for this?" asked Ray demandingly. "Of course. Say it." I grabbed my bag from the trunk and headed for the door. Ray followed behind me. I put the key in the lock and turned it. At least Terry hasn't changed the locks yet, I thought. I swung the door open and a horrible smell immediately came over me. What the hell was that? I covered my mouth with my hand and looked inside. What I saw made me horrified and nauseous. I quickly closed the door and ran into the yard where I threw up. "What's going on? Are you okay?" asked Ray, coming up to me. "It's Terry." I stammered as the vomiting stopped. "He's dead." "What dead?" almost shouted Ray. "Are you sure?" I stared at him. "I'm sure. My new couch is ruined and shit everywhere. What am I supposed to do?" "Well, I'd say you need to call 911, Ray replied in a nervous, shaky voice. "Holy shit, Captain Hindsight," I told him sarcastically. He recoiled, but quickly regained his composure and looked at me like I just turned into a cobra. "I'm sorry, Ray. I didn't mean to snap at you. I just didn't expect this. Would you mind staying with me, at least until the cops come?" I reached out a hand to his arm to reassure him and myself. "I think I can sit here for a few minutes," he said, his voice suddenly sounding reluctant. "But this is your mess. You have to clean it up. Thanks." I snorted back and discussed pulling my phone out of my purse. Jerk, I thought, dialing 911. The female operator said soothingly that the police were on their way and should arrive within the next hour. She suggested I stay outside the house until they cleaned it up. Given the stench, I happily agreed. We got into Ray's Maserati to wait for the cops, and then it hit me. Terry was dead. I didn't want this. I wanted everything else to stay the same. I wanted him to take care of me in my old age. Realizing that, I burst into tears. Ray put his arm around me as I sobbed over the loss of Terry. "You know you're going to have to call Bledsoe," Ray said when I had calmed down a little. "It's bound to be in the paper. The neighbors will talk. You'll have to write no obituary. Even if you cremate and scatter it quickly, quietly, and privately, there will be repercussions. And the firm doesn't like to be taken by surprise." "I know," I said quietly. "Wilson Bledsoe was the managing partner of the firm we worked for. You should probably call him now before the police arrive," Ray suggested seriously. "You're right," I snapped quietly, and immediately pulled myself together. I was a lawyer, I reminded myself firmly. Then I pulled out my cell phone and dialed Bledsoe's home number. He answered after the third ring. "Good evening, Helen," he said in his usual slow, deliberate tone. "What can I do for you?" "Mr. Bledsoe, my husband is dead. It seems he killed himself," I told him, and my voice suddenly trembled. Well, that explains why he never responded to my email. Wilson replied in exactly the same deliberate tone. "An email?" I asked, puzzled as to why my boss would want to write to Terry. "Yes, I got a rather disturbing email from him on Friday night. I didn't see it until after Georgia and I got back from dinner at the country club, but I replied as soon as I saw it." "Is it true?" "What is true, sir?" I asked, now concerned. "That you spent the weekend with Ray Bland. We're intimate? Is that true?" He repeated insistently in the same even relentless tone he used to question witnesses. "Yes, sir, it's true," I said, suddenly afraid for my job. There was a morals clause in the firm's employee handbook, and I knew I could be fired for what I had done. I also knew that in Bledsoe's case, if I was caught lying, whatever I was facing would be 10 times worse. "I'm sorry to hear that, Helen. Of course, I'm sorry to hear about your husband. Have you called the police yet?" "Yes, sir, already," I replied. "You'll have your hands full for a few days. Why don't you take a week's vacation and deal with your husband's death? We'll discuss your actions and your future at this firm when you return." "But I have the Wilson case," I protested. "Jenny Hawkins is your second assistant on this case, isn't she?" asked Wilson. He must have known perfectly well that she was, after all, he had appointed her. "Yes, sir, she is," I said, feeling my hand go numb and the phone begin to shake. "Jenny is a competent attorney. I'll have her file a continuance so she can get up to speed. You, on the other hand, need to concentrate on your husband's final preparations. But I have to say, Helen, I'm very disappointed in you." "I understand, sir," I said, swallowing nervously. "Is Mr. Bland with you now?" asked Wilson. His tone hadn't changed throughout the conversation, and he was as devoid of emotion as a coroner pointing out a bullet hole in an autopsy. "Yes, sir, that's him," I replied. "Would you be kind enough to inform him to report to my office first thing in the morning, please?" Wilson ordered. The tone was definitely commanding, with a strong undertone of, "Don't even think of disobeying." "Yes, sir, I'll tell him," I said. "Thank you. I'm sorry for your loss, Helen. We'll talk later." "Have a good day," Wilson said, and ended the conversation. I was stunned. You'd think he faced a dozen calls like this every day. I shook myself up, put the phone away, and looked at Ray grimly. "Well," asked Ray awkwardly. "Ernest, Mr. Bledsoe wants to see you first thing in the morning. Apparently Terry sent him a letter telling him what we're doing," I replied. My world was crumbling, and I was completely powerless to stop it. Why had Terry done this to me? "Shit," Ray sighed. "That means we're totally screwed," I said, finishing his sentence. "Maybe," Ray said, "or maybe we're not. Since we both have seniority and this was the first time, maybe they'll have mercy on us." "You don't really believe that, do you?" I asked. "Not really, but I can hope." "Shit, Helen, I'm so sorry." "Me too, Ray. I'm as much to blame for this as you are," I admitted. I had no idea he'd react like that. At that moment, 2 police cars with flashing beacons stopped in front of the house, and a coroner's van pulled up behind them. One of the officers approached Ray from the side of the car and asked him to move over so the van could pull in. The other officer with the clipboard asked me to get out of the car. I got out as soon as Ray started the car. "Are you Miss Helen Baker?" the officer asked. "Yes," I admitted. "May I see some identification?" he asked. I pulled out my driver's license and held it out to him. He filled out the form, reading the information on my license. I watched as 3 officers and 2 others from the medical examiner's office entered the house, wearing latex gloves and white booties. As they opened the door, the officers cringed and an odor hit their nostrils. 2 coroner's technicians donned Tyvek masks and suits and rolled a gurney into the house. "When you tell me what happened, Mrs. Baker," the officer asked, getting my attention. "I left the house Friday afternoon. Terry was alive and sitting on the couch when I left. I don't know what happened after that. I came back shortly before I called 911, I explained. "Terry, is this your husband, the victim?" the officer asked. "Yes," I said. "And you say you were gone all weekend?" he asked, raising his eyebrows. I answered in the affirmative again while the officer made his notes. "And what did you do this weekend?" the officer asked in a neutral tone. "I was with a coworker." I answered a little evasively, causing him to raise his eyebrows again as he filled out a form on his clipboard. It annoyed me, and my stomach twisted even more. It was one thing to tell my husband what I was about to do, and quite another to confess to a stranger. "Is this the gentleman you were with when we arrived?" the officer asked. "Yes," I confirmed, trying to be detached and failing miserably. I'd attended hundreds of interrogations and even given a few, but this was the first time this had happened to me. He tried to hide his body language, but I realized he'd guessed and correctly what I'd been up to. He asked me a few more questions, which I answered as briefly as possible. Another 20 minutes passed before he finished taking my statement. I tried to talk nonchalantly, but the officer was focused. I could feel my face redden as I was required to report that I had been at the most exclusive nightclub in the city from early Friday night to late Friday night, and then didn't leave the confines of one of the most prestigious apartment complexes in the city from 11 o'clock Friday night to 4 o'clock Sunday night. I even had to turn in my apartment number. Okay, what was I supposed to do? Take a fifth? Demand a meeting with my lawyer? He was taking witness statements at a possible crime scene. I was just a bystander. "Even if I was involved, that's all I have for now, Mrs. Baker," he said. "I need to speak to your colleague." With those words, the officer walked out and headed off to talk to Ray. As he walked, he passed the spot where I had thrown up on the lawn. He stopped for a moment, had the nerve to make a note, and then continued on his way. I looked around. It was already evening, but there was still plenty of light. I could see neighbors in the windows looking out with curiosity at what was going on. Some of them even came out to their front porches and gawked at what was going on. Damn it! Did all of this really have to be so public? Maybe I should have entertained Ray a few more times and come back after dark. A few minutes later, I saw the technicians from the medical examiner's office come out of the house with a gurney carrying Terry's body in a closed bag. I shuddered, but for some reason I couldn't look away. They put the gurney in the back of their van, closed the door, and removed their white suits. Carefully folding the suits into a plastic bag, they got into the van and drove off. The officers got out after them, and a man in sergeant stripes headed toward me, carrying 2 plastic bags. "Mrs. Baker, I'm Sergeant Smith," he said. "We found this weapon next to your husband's body. Did you know he had this gun?" he asked, holding up the bag that contained Terry's gun. "Yes, I knew," I replied. "It was a gift from his grandfather. He's had it for years." I felt myself shivering a little, more than a little. Before it was just a piece of metal that I hadn't seen or remembered. Now my gut saw it as a deadly weapon. I suddenly wondered if Terry had gotten it after I left, or if he had it when I left, and was going to use it against Ray or even me before turning it on himself. All these murder-suicides that had been on the evening news for years, and that I'd barely paid attention to, suddenly came crashing down on me. Terry loved me, damn it, didn't he? He let me have everything I wanted. Why not this? "We found this on the coffee table, too," the sergeant said, holding out a bag containing a piece of paper. "Obviously, he intended this for you." I took the package from the sergeant and saw the typewritten note and Terry's wedding ring. Trembling, I read the note through the plastic. "Helen," the note began, "I would rather die than be your cuckold. I've loved you exclusively for a quarter of a century and have always put your needs before my own, and this is how you repay me. Well, screw you, you selfish, worthless bitch. I'm the one who pulled the trigger, but my blood is on your hands. When you went off for a weekend of fun with Ray Bland, you killed our marriage. You killed me. I hope you live a long and miserable life, bitch, and my rotting corpse haunts you every time you close your eyes." The short note ended. "Rot and hell, bitch." With shaking hands, I handed the note back to the sergeant. I knew he'd need it to finish filling out the report. My knees were shaking harder than my hands, but they didn't buckle. If I wasn't in shock before, I was now. I thought about what Terry had written. He had never used such language in my presence ever, and his letter shook me to the core. Honestly, I hadn't realized he had it in him. Maybe if he had told me that on Thursday, when I told him my plans, I wouldn't have left and Terry would still be alive. It was with a heavy feeling that I realized that the crucial word was maybe. But I can't stand speculation and maybe. I'm a lawyer, which means I have to work with the hand I'm dealt, even if I drew it myself. I took a couple deep breaths to keep my cool and looked at the sergeant. The reason I was trying to slip into the jury on behalf of my clients. I strongly suspected that my own reasonable doubts were lying in a puddle in the front yard, and whatever jurors eventually appeared before me would not elicit much sympathy. "Can I go back to my house now?" asked I. "We're still examining the scene, ma'am, and frankly, it's pretty bad out there. According to our coroner, your husband committed suicide sometime Friday night, and I don't think you should stay here, at least not for a couple days. I took the liberty of calling the cleaning service, and they should be here soon. If I were you, I'd find a hotel and stay there until at least Tuesday or Wednesday. Can I at least get my computer and a few things to get me through a couple days?" I asked in my professional tone. "When we're done," said the sergeant. "It could take another hour." He studied me for a few moments, then pulled a card out of his pocket and held it out to me. "I realize this is all a shock to you, ma'am. I strongly recommend that you talk to someone. I recommend Gina Hastings. She's an excellent counselor. She's the one the department refers us to when an officer is experiencing trauma at work. Tell her you spoke to me, and I'm sure she'll get you in quickly." "Thank you, Sergeant Smith," I replied. I was annoyed at the thought of needing a counselor. I think about it. The look on his face was almost inscrutable, but I could sense disapproval and concern. Finally, I stood before him, vibrating like a church bell. "Take your pick, ma'am, but I think you should call her as soon as possible. If not her, then a pastor or a good friend," the sergeant said, then went back inside. Sighing, I walked to the porch and sat down on the swinging bench that Terry had installed last summer. It was another thing I insisted he do for me. As I sat on the bench, it dawned on me that we had only used it once since he had put it up. I thought about what Terry had written. Even if I closed my eyes, I could still see the writing. After a few minutes, Ray came over and sat on the bench next to me, not too close. I looked around. Almost all the neighbors had gone back inside or pulled the curtains after the van left, so there seemed to be a handful of persistent fidgeters left. "What did they want?" I asked, uncertainly. "They wanted to know how we spent the weekend," Ray replied with a sigh. "You told them everything?" I glanced at him, too stunned to summon up anger. "Almost everything." "I didn't tell them every last detail, just the Reader's Digest version," Ray said, clearly no pun intended. "What did that sergeant want?" "Terry wrote a suicide note," I told him blankly. "Erna, crying about how much he loved you and couldn't live without you?" asked Ray sarcastically. "No, he said what he should have said to me Thursday night. Called me a bitch and said his blood is on my hands. And you know what?" "What?" asked Ray. "He's right. I'm a selfish bitch, and his death is on my conscience." "You can't blame yourself. He's the one who pulled the trigger, not you," Ray replied, and what he probably thought was a soothing tone. "After all, he doesn't own you. You have the right to make your own decisions." "You're right," I almost whispered, pondering Terry's letter. "And I should be responsible for the consequences of my decisions." Ray stared at me for a moment, which I barely caught, and then continued. "I've thought all this through, and I think I know how to address Bloodsoe in the morning. Once I'm divorced and you're widowed, the firm has no one to cause trouble with lawsuits. Our little date was personal and had no subtext in the news, no political corruption or social scandal. Just a small matter between consenting adults. It's unlikely to be noticeable to anyone and will disappear in a few days. So there is no upside for a firm to fire or ask for the resignation of two high-ranking employees. It's stronger if we both make the same argument. I'll call you tomorrow after the meeting and let you know so we can coordinate efforts." I looked at him. Terry was nothing more than a splash. The man who I now realized, albeit too late, treated me like a queen was a splash. The man I had treated as a serf was now demoted to even a slip. Ray was anxious to save his career and his job, and had no idea that I was now desperately trying to save my sanity. For a few moments I pondered his words. Technically, I knew he was right. There was no political corruption or social scandal, but I also knew that Bledsoe was firmly committed to the firm's code of conduct, especially as it pertained to employee relations. "Let me know what Bledsoe has to say," I finally managed to say. "I will." "Are you going to be okay?" asked Ray. "I'll be fine," I replied. Truth be told, I doubted I'd ever be okay again, but I was determined not to let Ray know that. "Call me if you need anything," Ray said before walking away. "Yeah, okay," I mumbled as he walked away. Shortly after Ray left, an unmarked white van pulled into the driveway. A young man with shoulder-length blonde hair got out of it and walked up to the porch. "Is this the Baker house?" he asked. "Yes," I confirmed. "And who are you?" "Jack Harrison, Harrison Cleaning Services. I've been told there's been an incident," he replied, professionally holding out a business card to me. "Yes," I said quietly. "The police are still inside." "Great, thanks," he nodded. I watched as he put on his mask, boots, and gloves, then went inside. Back and the police officers came out a few minutes later. Sergeant Smith walked over to me as the others went to their cars. "We're done, Mrs. Baker," he said. "Here's my card. The case number is on the back. I'll have a report ready in a day or two. If you have any questions, please call me." "Thank you." "Can I get my stuff now?" I asked. "Of course. But you might want to put on a mask and booties before you go inside," said the sergeant. "Mr. Harrison has some he can let you use." "Thank you," I said, taking his card. I put it in my purse as Jack walked up with a pair of boots and a fresh mask. The officers left while I put on the mask and boots. Jack opened a small jar of mentholatum. "Might want to put some of that on your nose. It's still pretty bad up there," he advised. I followed his instructions and went into the house. The ointment helped, but I could still smell the foul odor. I inspected the mess on the large sectional sofa and realized I would have to replace it. I had spent over $6,000 on this couch, and it wasn't even 8 months old. Then I looked at the abstract painting that just had to hang above the couch. It was an abstract painting that had cost me over $2,000. It was now completely ruined, and Terry's blood and brain matter splattered it. The carpet in front of the couch was soaked with blood and other fluids that made me shudder. I can get it all off the carpet. Hopefully the subfloor underneath isn't soaked too badly. I don't know if I'll be able to recover the couch. "I'll do my best," Jack assured me. "Please do," I said quietly. How long will you be here? It'll probably take me most of the night to get everything done. Can I call or leave a message when I leave? Yes, I said, handing him one of my cards with my cell phone number on it. Just lock up when you leave, please. I felt like I was taking a risk leaving this man here alone, but I needed to get out. Besides, he was licensed and insured. It said so on his card, and I could always sue him if something went missing. Yes, ma'am, he replied politely, taking my card and slipping it into his overalls pocket. I went upstairs, packed my things for 3 days, grabbed my laptop bag, and quickly left the house before my stomach rebelled again. Jack was already hard at work in the front room. I told him I was leaving, and he waved as I walked toward the garage through the kitchen. I pulled up to the Holiday Inn Express, a hotel not far from our house, and went inside, hoping they had a room available. Luckily, the room was found, and I handed the clerk my ATM card. A few minutes later, she returned, frowning slightly. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this card has been declined," she said, holding the card back out to me. "What?" I asked, shocked. We always had enough in our joint account to pay at least 6 months' worth of bills. We'll have to find out, I thought, grabbing my credit card, the balance of which I knew was more than enough to pay for the room. The card worked, and I went up to the room. I was angry that our ATM card didn't work, and I was determined to get to the bottom of it. The first thing I did was turn on my laptop and logged into our joint account. If Terry were alive, I'd kill him myself, I thought. When our account opened, I saw a warning that the account balance was low. I almost lost my senses when I saw the balance. $24. What the hell had Terry done? Digging deeper, I saw that he had donated all but $24 to children's charities, including a local church orphanage. I'm sure this was his way of letting me know that he wasn't happy about my decision not to have children. But why was it necessary to leave $24 out of the thousands we had in our account? My biggest concern was covering the bills we had to pay this month. All of our bills were paid automatically, so I transferred enough from my account to pay this month's bills. I wondered if Terry had done something similar with his account. I didn't have the credentials to log into his online banking, so I made a note to stop by the bank tomorrow. By this point, I was exhausted both mentally and physically. Plus, I was hungry since I hadn't eaten anything since lunch. So I stopped at the nearest fast food restaurant and ate a greasy hamburger, which didn't go down too well on my already queasy stomach. Back in my room, I showered and got ready for bed. I was so tired that I fell asleep as soon as I laid my head on the pillow. Well, well, well. "I see you finally decided to get your lecherous ass back in the house," said a male voice. I looked around but saw nothing but a thick, dark fog. I realized I was dreaming, and the voice sounded like Terry's. Only it wasn't the quiet, soft Terry I knew. There was some sharpness in that voice. "Terry, is that you?" I asked uncertainly. "I can't see you. Can you come out so I can see you? Please?" "Sure," a male voice replied. I saw a shadowy figure step forward. I almost threw up when I saw him. Half of his head was missing. As he walked towards me, shards of bone fell away from his skull, and I could see what was left of his brain. I was horrified and took a step back. Then I shook myself up. This had to be a nightmare. This had to be it. No, this isn't real. You're not real. You're just an undigestible piece of that nasty, fatty hamburger I stuffed inside me before I went to bed. You've got more fat than blood in you, I declared with far more courage than I actually had. His eyes flashed red and he headed toward me. First the smell reached me, then the blazing eyes practically blinded me, and then a primal scream made me jump back and fall to one knee with my hands above my head. "Good. Okay," I repeated frantically. "This is real. You're real. You better believe it. You pathetic excuse for a wife." He growled dangerously. "Terry," I started, but he held up a hand to silence me. "Shut up, bitch. This is all on your conscience." "What do you think?" he asked, turning his head so I could see the exit wound on the left side of his head. "Not much different than that $2,000 piece of shit you just had to put over the couch." "I thought you liked that painting." I objected weakly, a little discouraged by the venom in his tone. "I hated her, but she made you happy, and that's all that mattered to me at the time. Besides, I figured you'd get sick of it after a year or two, just like you obviously got bored with me. So was having fun with Ray Bland worth what it cost you?" I lowered my eyes in embarrassment, but didn't say anything. While I hated to lose Terry over it, the truth was that it was the best entertainment I'd experienced in a long time. You don't need to say anything. Your innermost thoughts are perfectly transparent here, Helen, Terry said gloatingly. I felt my face burning and tried to look away from him, but it didn't help. Everywhere I looked, he was standing there, right in front of me. I read your note. I stammered out, desperate to change the subject. Why didn't you mention all this on Thursday when I told you about Ray? Would it have done any good? Asked Terry grudgingly as if he already knew the answer. I guess it wouldn't. I don't know. Guess we'll never know now, will we? I spat back weakly, hating to be defensive, but I had no explanation or excuse. There was nowhere to hide. I think we both know the answer to that question, Terry snorted wryly. What did you do with our money? I asked, trying desperately to change the subject. At the thought of being robbed of my legitimate money, my anger began to rise. Bills still need to be paid. You're a smart woman. You'll figure it out on your own, he replied dismissively, shrugging his blood-spattered shoulders. Sit. I already know you gave everything to children's charities. Why? I asked, my anger building faster than my fear. What do you care? You denied me children even though you knew how much I wanted a child when we got married. I decided he should be where he could be put to good use. If I can't pass it on to my own child, I decided that other children should enjoy the fruits of my years of labor, at least the one you haven't spent yet. But what about me? You know how I feel about having children, I protested, becoming furious. Yes, I do. After we've been married for a few years, you made it clear that you didn't want to be burdened with a career and a baby. You didn't want to lose your figure. You always thought a baby would interfere with your work and your climb to the top, and you got your way as you always do, just like you did with Ray. By the way, how are you doing with that? At least I'm still alive? I didn't choose the coward's way, I hissed. His eyes flashed red, and I suddenly hoped frantically that this was some kind of sick, guilty dream. If this was reality, I was totally screwed. Cowardly way out, huh? You think it was easy for me to blow my head off? I don't think so. It was the second hardest thing I've ever done. You know what was the hardest? He growled. His growl was like the growl of a wolf sinking its fangs into your throat. No. What? I whispered back, startled by the change of subject. Watching you walk out the door to be with Ray, Terry growled again. After 24 years of devotion, the tone of his voice was far scarier than the sight of his mangled body. I told you it was just one weekend. I told you I loved you. You knew I'd come back, I said in desperation. Yeah, that's exactly what you said on Thursday. Do you remember what you were doing right before you left? No, not really, I said. What? You patted me on head like a damn dog. You obviously thought I'd agree to be your willing cuckold. Okay, I don't remember that, but I'm pretty sure I meant love, I protested. Net. Terry suppressed a blood-chilling cuckold before continuing. Yeah, that's right. You expect me to believe that shit? It's true. I didn't want to hurt you. It would have just been one weekend, and then we'd have the rest of our lives together. We would have gotten through it, I insisted. Do you really think that after that weekend I would want to touch you again? Knowing what you did. And probably would do it again when the itch came back. You're just delusional. I told you I'd rather die than be your willing cuckold. And don't lie to me. I know that's exactly what you meant. How do you know that? I asked. Remember, your thoughts are transparent here. Look, he added, pointing to something to his right. I couldn't help myself. My eyes followed his gesture. Out of nowhere, a cloud of swirling silvery mist appeared, which then turned into a large silvery disk. I felt a cold, terrifying ripple run through my mind, my soul, and I groaned. An image appeared on the disk, like a window into another reality. For a moment, I thought I was watching some cheap movie, but in a flash of horror, I recognized my wife and Ray. Good God. Was this really how I saw Terry when I thought about it? There was a gurgle of agonizing disgust right behind my left ear, and I didn't dare turn around to look as I realized that, like icy claws tearing at me, what was left of my husband was standing right behind me. I cried out weakly in pure, distilled, petrified fear and tried desperately to deny what I was up to, mentally chasing it away. Unfortunately, the next revelation was even worse. I was the undisputed star of this particular show. That didn't happen, I protested hoarsely. No, but you and Ray talked about it, planned it, Terry said. You may well have done it. What excuse were you going to give me? Were you going to say it was only going to be a one-time thing? I looked at Terry, shocked. How could he possibly know about this? Yes, Ray and I had discussed it, but we hadn't made any firm plans. Really? But none of that happened, I insisted. It doesn't matter. Here, where I am, thinking and talking about something is the same as doing it, Terry replied. And what is it exactly? Heaven, I asked with a dismissive smirk. This asked Terry, looking around the place where we were standing. I don't think so, and before you ask, it's not another place. It's just a meeting place between your reality and mine, Terry explained. At that moment, I heard a loud zing and a red light began to shine through the fog. What was that? I asked. Our time has come to an end. I have to get back, said Terry. Don't worry, we'll talk again, I'm sure. Wait, I have a question, I pleaded. Just one, sarcastically retorted Terry. For now, why did you leave $24 in the account? You're a smart woman, counselor. You'll figure it out for yourself, Terry hissed. See ya, he added, and turned his back to me. I sat up in bed, my body covered in sweat. Sunlight streamed into the hotel room, and I glanced at the clock. 8:30 in the morning. Damn it. I knew I'd fallen asleep last night, but I felt like I just finished a marathon. Exhausted, I walked into the small bathroom and did my business, then looked at myself in the mirror. There were dark bags hanging under my bloodshot eyes, and my face looked even more wrinkled than before. I'm only 46 years old, but the face in the mirror looked at least 10 years older. I remembered Terry telling me many times that I looked 10 years younger than my years and sighed heavily. I had a full day ahead of me, so I showered and then dressed in my usual jeans and a simple blouse. After checking myself one last time, I went downstairs to get some breakfast and a much-needed cup of coffee. Today was the first day of my entire screwed-up life. At the time, I didn't know how screwed up it would be yet. Chapter 2. Sinette. I walked into the small dining room and picked up the morning paper. I was eerily curious to see if there were any reports of Terry's suicide. After getting a light breakfast and a cup of coffee, I sat down in a corner, away from prying eyes, and opened the paper. There was a small notice on page 2 about Terry Baker apparently shooting himself and surviving, but my name wasn't mentioned, which made me feel a little better. The last thing I needed was unwanted attention from well-wishers. I finished my breakfast and walked to my car. As I got in my car, I heard my phone ring, pulled it out of my purse, and saw that it was a call from Ray. I remembered that Wilson Bledsoe wanted to meet him early this morning, so I answered the phone. Hey, Ray, I said. How'd it go? About as well as I expected, Ray replied in a resigned tone. They put me on administrative leave while they investigate and determine my fate. You know they have policies and procedures for this kind of thing that they have to follow, but things aren't looking good. When will you know the outcome? I asked. Sometime in the next 2 weeks, Ray said. But I'm not going to sit on my laurels. I'm going to probe the candidates. We'll see what happens. How are you holding up? He added, as if by the way. I'll be fine, I replied bravely, not wanting to tell him about the disturbing nightmare of last night that still haunted me. Just then, another thought hit me. By the way, does anyone else in the office know? Only anyone with an internal email address, Ray replied annoyingly. Looks like your kitty husband told everyone. Shit, I sighed, seeing my career and reputation go down the toilet. Anyway, there's no point in hiding it now. Do you want to meet for lunch or something? He asked with a slight hopefulness. I stared at my phone for a moment. It was like I was reading his mind. He was on vacation and had nothing to do but look for a job and have some more fun. Hell, I just turned my life around. Finally, I broke the tense silence. I have a lot to do today, so I don't think I'll have time. Besides, I don't think that would be wise under the circumstances, do you? I asked back a little sharply. You're probably right. I'd better let you go. Call me if you need anything, Ray said. We ended the conversation and I checked my messages out of curiosity. I saw a message from Jack letting me know he was leaving the house. The message was sent at 5:30 a.m., meaning he had been there all night. I saw another message from my older sister, Janice. I saw the paper this morning. Is that your Terry who killed himself? Yes, I texted back. I'll call and explain later, I added before sending the message. This was 2 years older than me, and while we'd always gotten along well, she tended to play the role of mother hen. Truth be told, I just didn't want to fight with her at the moment. I drove up to the house and parked in the garage. As I walked through the door leading into the kitchen, I noticed that the bad smell of Terry's blood and other bodily fluids was gone, but it had been replaced by the almost overpowering odor of pungent cleaning products. I avoided taking deep breaths for fear that the air would dry out my lungs. Walking to the front room, I was surprised to see that the couch looked almost new. It would have saved me from having to replace the $6,000 couch, but I swore I would never sit on it again. For a moment, I was angry at Terry for not killing himself in his chair. I also turned my attention to the painting above the couch and was pleased to see that Jack had managed to save it as well. I noticed by that Jack had done a good job of cleaning and restoring the living room. I went upstairs to the room we used as our home office. I went through our files and grabbed what I needed. A folder with Terry's bank information, another folder with our wills and other legal documents, and a folder with our mortgage insurance policy all went into my briefcase. I couldn't help but notice how quiet the place was without him. It seemed too quiet to me. I could clearly hear the grandfather clock ticking downstairs, ticking away the seconds, and for a moment I thought I smelled something rotten. Rotten. And a chill ran down my spine. Then I felt a knot of cold air rushed through the room, and I had to fight myself not to run away. I shook off the more than anxious feeling and went on about my business. Then I remembered that Terry's work needed to be notified of his suicide. Looking at the answering machine on his desk, I saw that there were several messages, and I listened to them. They were all from his work, wondering if he was coming in and asking if he was okay. Sighing, I called back and was connected to Allison Jones, Terry's immediate supervisor. "Helen, is everything okay? We've called several times but never heard anything. It's not like Terry to be late. Is he all right?" asked Allison anxiously. "No, Allison. He's dead," I replied, and as calm and level a voice as I could manage, causing Allison to flinch. "Dead? Oh my God, what happened? Did he have a heart attack?" "No. He shot himself," I said, marveling at how calm I'd been when I'd accidentally informed Terry's boss that he'd killed himself. "Oh no," Allison sighed. "When did it happen? I was told it happened Friday night. I was away over the weekend," I said, hoping to ward off further questions. "I'm very sorry, Helen. Please let us know when the wake will be held." "I know everyone here will want to attend," Allison said. "I'll have HR contact you about insurance and his company's 401k. And please feel free to call any time if you need anything." "Thank you, Allison. I appreciate it," I said, trying to sound sincere, but I was relieved that she didn't seem to have any more questions. We said our goodbyes and ended the conversation. It had gone better than I thought it would. I knew that Terry's company insured all of their employees for 2.5 times their annual salary. That amounts to almost $250,000. I didn't know if the policy had a suicide clause, but I knew Terry had quite a bit of money in his 401k. That would definitely come in handy. And I put the phone in its holder and suddenly realized how quiet and peaceful the house was. We had lived here for over 20 years, and for the most part they had been good years, full of happiness and joy. But now the house seemed like a grave. Looking around, I saw Terry everywhere, remembering our life together. At least it was only memories, not his mangled ghost. A chill ran down my spine. I suddenly thought someone Terry watching me. But my logical mind took over, and I decided firmly that I was alone. I walked around the house, opening the windows, hoping that the throat-eating chemical smell would dissipate while I was gone. I shook myself up, grabbed my briefcase, and left the house, maybe a little hastily. I made it to the bank and went inside. When it was my turn, I asked the teller to tell me the balance of Terry's account. Although we each had separate accounts, we had signed signature cards and had access to each other's ATM cards for emergencies. I pulled Terry's second ATM card out of the folder and noted the PIN he had written on the inside of the folder. Looking at his computer, the teller frowned slightly, then turned to me again. "One moment, please, Mrs. Baker," he said politely, and headed toward the row of glass booths. A few minutes later, he returned with Arnold Johnson, the bank manager. We had worked with Arnold for many years. "Mrs. Baker, would you come into my office for a moment?" he asked with a friendly smile. "Of course," I said, following him in. I took the seat he pointed to and watched as he sat on the other side of his massive dark wood desk, studying something on his computer. I'm glad you came in this morning, Mrs. Baker, Arnold said. I was planning on calling you later today. Oh, I asked, feeling curiosity and concern in equal parts. Why? Our system flagged a lot of transactions over the weekend from 2 of your accounts. I wanted to make sure you were aware of them, Arnold said. I know my husband made several charitable donations on Friday, I said. He made those donations without consulting me. I was hoping they could be stopped and canceled before they went public. I also wanted to see what activity was going on in his account. Arnold's eyebrows rose at that. He looked at the monitor before answering. I'm afraid that's not possible, Mrs. Baker. It looks like he made the donations right before the deadline on Friday, so almost all of them have already come in. I need that money, I pleaded. Is there any way to get it back? I suppose you could contact them and explain the circumstances. They might release the money, but there are no guarantees, Arnold explained, almost apologetically. I can give you a printout of all the recipients. He looked at the screen again. It's going to be a pretty long list. I've weighed the pros and cons very seriously. A simple appeal would probably not allow for a refund. I suppose I could always sue them, but with all these charities, I'll probably end up paying more in legal fees and court costs than I'll get. Plus, my reputation would suffer even more. I had an empty, sinking feeling, and I could almost see the headlines. Greedy lawyer sued to deprive needy children of food and shelter. I could also envision the jury deliberating the case. So we have a whore whose adultery caused her husband to kill himself. Now she wants to starve orphans and make them homeless. I say we give her the middle finger. I'll be lucky if they don't vote to tar and feather me in public. If nothing else, you'll have a hell of a tax deduction, Arnold said, in a vain attempt to lighten the atmosphere. I stared at him dumbly, slightly puzzled by his attempt at humor. After a few awkward moments, he cleared his throat and hastily looked away. What about Terry's account? I asked, trying to change the subject. Arnold stared at his computer for a few moments, then at a copy of the signature cards and forms pertaining to the account. He sighed, put on a professional expression, and looked at me before continuing. He has enough funds to keep the account open. There was a lot of activity there on Friday, too. He paid off his credit card and then canceled it. It looks like he paid for other things as well. He paused, as if expecting me to say something, but I only stared at him with a blank expression. Finally, he finished. And there's one large payment to the West Side Funeral Home and Crematory. That hit me right between the eyes. I knew about that funeral home. It was the one that had taken care of Terry's parents when they died. Obviously, Terry had thought hard about his suicide. What about our other accounts? I asked. He didn't touch anything else. Your joint savings account and certificates of deposit are still intact, Arnold said, returning to his computer. Good, I replied, pleased with the news. Is there anything else you need, Mrs. Baker? He asked. Yes, I replied, pulling another folder out of my briefcase. I need to apply for insurance on our mortgage. Our mortgage was handled by the bank, and they insisted that we take out an insurance policy to pay off if anything happened to Terry or me. Mem, we took out the policy through the bank's home loan department, and I already knew it didn't have a suicide clause. I handed the papers to Arnold, who reviewed them, and then turned to his computer again. Everything seems to be in order, he said, and pulled another form out of a drawer. We need you to fill this out and return it along with a copy of your husband's death certificate. I see that you have a payment due in a couple of weeks. The sooner you get this back to me, the better. I'll let the home loan office know so they can expect it. Thank you, Arnold, I said, tucking the application form into my briefcase. My pleasure, Mrs. Baker, and my condolences. If there's anything else we can do to help, please call, Arnold said as we shook hands. His demeanor was strictly professional, but I couldn't fight the nagging feeling that he was judging me. I tried to shake off that feeling. Send it. I thanked him and walked out of the bank feeling a little better than before I came in. By this time, I was a little hungry, so I stopped at the store for a snack and then went to the West Side Funeral Home. I was greeted almost immediately by a thin young man in a white shirt and tie. His hair was carefully combed and seemed to be coated with a thin layer of hairspray. He smiled and extended his hand, which I accepted. Welcome to the West Side Funeral Home. I'm Alan Markham. What can I do for you? He asked in a friendly tone. I'm here about my husband, Terry Baker, I said. Baker, that name is familiar to me. Please step into my office, Alan said with a smile. Set, I followed him into the beautifully furnished office and accepted his offer of coffee. Handing me a cup with a hot beverage, he sat down at his computer and stared at the screen for a few moments. "Yes, I see him here. I tried to call him today, but I couldn't get through. That's because he's dead," I managed to say quietly. "I understand," Alan said slowly and quietly. "I'm sorry to hear that. When did this happen?" "Friday," I said, deciding not to tell more than I needed to. According to this, he ordered a basic cremation service and paid for it in full. Friday. It's not unusual for clients to pay for funerals in advance, but it is unusual for them to pay so soon before they need our services, Alan commented calmly. "Was he terminally ill?" "No," I replied, again, refusing to tell more than I needed to. There was a pause before he replied, looking at the screen rather than at me. "Then it looks like we need to make final arrangements. Do you have his death certificate?" "No, not yet," I replied. I knew it could take a couple of weeks to get a certificate. His body was taken to the morgue on Sunday night. When the coroner is done, I'll get it. When they release his body and you get the certificate, let me know and we'll proceed, Mrs. Baker, Alan said. We spent the next hour discussing the various arrangements. Neither Terry nor I were regular churchgoers, but I knew he had been raised in one of the mainline Protestant denominations, either Methodist or Lutheran. From what I understood, there was no need for a memorial service. They could just cremate him and be done with it. Alan asked if I wanted to keep Terry's remains, but just thinking about it sent shivers running down my spine. "No problem. Mr. Baker paid for his remains to be buried in the columbarium unless you want to take them," Alan said. I walked out of the funeral home depressed. I needed someone to talk to. Looking at my watch, I realized that Janice was probably already home since she worked part-time at the county library. I took a chance and called her house. "Hey, sis," Janice said when she answered. "I kept wondering when you were going to call." "I've been a little busy this morning," I answered. "I didn't realize there would be so many details. Would you mind if I stop by your place? I really need someone to talk to," I added hopefully. "Of course," Janice said in her motherly voice that I knew so well. "Richard is still in the hospital and won't be home until late, so we'll have plenty of time to catch up." Richard, Janice's husband, was a surgeon at the medical center and often worked long hours. "Thanks, sis. I'll be there in a few minutes." We finished talking, and I drove the rest of the way to her house. We had always gotten along well, and I knew I could tell her anything. I wasn't sure how she would take it, though. She greeted me cheerfully at the door when I pulled up in her driveway. "I got your message. Would you like to talk about it over a cup of tea?" she asked kindly. "Sure," I replied as Janice walked into the kitchen. I sat down at the dining table and fidgeted in my chair as I listened to her fuss. I pondered how to pull it all off. A few minutes later, she returned with 2 cups of hot tea. I liked sugar, so I stirred it into the cup after she handed me the cup. I wanted to get right into the story I was telling myself, but suddenly my tongue was untied. "So tell me what happened," Janice asked, sitting down at the table. I took a sip of tea, gathering my thoughts, sighed heavily, and told her about my weekend with Ray. To her credit, Janice listened quietly as I recounted my short break in my marriage and what I'd encountered when I returned home. She didn't interrupt me once, and her face was completely neutral as I told the whole story. I inwardly shuddered, but kept my voice steady as I described everything that had happened. Well, except for the fact that I had planned to have Ray entertain me in front of Terry when we got home. That wasn't important. And the nightmare about Terry, since I didn't want her to think I was crazy. And I didn't say anything about the fantasy I'd shared with Ray about being the center of attention for him and his friends. It was just a fantasy, and it had no effect on Terry's reaction, since he couldn't have known about it. Well, at least not until he... dead. Anyway. "And here I thought you were smarter than me," Janice said quietly when I was done. "After all, you became a big-time lawyer, married a man who busted his ass to support you while you finished college. Was your weekend worth that expense?" Your tone was flat and unemotional, but to me it was almost like a slap in the face. "It was just supposed to be a short break," I objected seriously. "I told Terry it didn't mean anything. It was just sex, something I needed to do before I got too old. Just one weekend. And he chose the coward's way." I snorted dismissively and stared into my cup instead of looking at the expression on my sister's face. In the back of my mind, I realized that I had just lied to my sister. I told Terry that it was just one weekend, but I'd planned for it to really be the first weekend of more. But Terry didn't know that then, and she didn't need to know that either. Just sex, huh? And you expected him to welcome you back with open arms like nothing happened? Come on, sis, you can't be that stupid, Janice said, having the quiet, motherly voice that I could see she used so effectively for her own children. Suddenly, I was indignant. I was a woman, and a damn beautiful one at that. Hadn't I just proven that? I had come for confirmation that I was fully justified, hurt, and inconvenienced, and I had a sinking feeling that seemed to foreshadow that I might not get everything I wanted. I glanced at her, and the expression on her face gave me a look of uneasiness, as if she could read my mind. Then the mother woman's tone returned, like an imperceptible whip with invisible barbs. Is that if Terry came home and said he was going away with a woman for the weekend before his attraction faded, would you welcome him home with open arms? I had never thought of that, and certainly never expected such an attack from my own sister. So I reflexively replied, first of all, Terry would never cheat on me. He wasn't that kind of person. Second, I would have destroyed him in the divorce, and he knew it. Even as I spoke, I realized how that sounded. I had just admitted to being exactly that kind of woman. If I was in a courtroom and stuck my foot in so deep, I'd call a recess. Janice didn't even blink, and I realized that she knew me so well that she expected me to react this way. I see. So you're allowed to play, and he's not, right? Janice asked, still in mother-woman mode. Of course not, I protested, losing my balance. He had no reason to need more variety when he had me. I was the one who needed more variety, deserved it. Then I realized how much more I'd given away, wrinkled my nose, and hastily added, besides, it was only once. Really? Or would you have gone further? Would you have made Terry watch or settle for sloppy seconds? Would you have brought home different men? My sister asked. I stared at her with my mouth open. This coming from my calm, traditional older sister. It was disorienting. What? You think I don't know about these things because I work part-time at the library? Did you do anything like that with Richard? I asked, shocked. Of course I haven't. I love and respect Richard too much to do something like that. But I know others who have done that. Her hint was obvious. That I no longer respected Terry was obvious, or I would never have done what I did. Dee's? And what did their husbands do? I asked, curiously awaiting her answer. Most of them divorced their wives, Janice said, taking a quiet sip of tea and then continued in the same tone. Of course, some went even further and exposed their wives to relatives and friends, emptying the family accounts, burning them. And you still haven't answered my question. Was having fun with this Ray Bland worth jeopardizing 24 years of marriage? It was suddenly as if someone had hit me over the head with one of those old commercials. And I realized the meaning of the $24 Terry had left in our joint account $1 for each year we'd been married. Damn. Janice must have noticed my sudden change in facial expression. What's the matter? She asked, raising her eyebrows. Terry donated all but $24 from our joint account to a bunch of children's charities. I mumbled by way of explanation as my brain digested this revelation. Really? Replied Janice, giggling. That's not funny. That account had 6 months' worth of bills on it, angrily exclaimed I. But you have to give him credit for style, said Janice with a slight chuckle. And what does that mean? I asked, growing increasingly angry. Didn't she realize the predicament this put me in? At least half of that money was mine. You denied him the one thing he always wanted, children. So in his final act of defiance, he gave your money to children's charities, knowing how much you don't want children of your own. Janice replied, shrugging her shoulders and ignoring my outburst of anger. I don't want kids. I just never wanted them. I objected sharply. Oh, please, Helen, I'm not stupid. I've seen the way you've behaved with our children. Why do you think they eventually left you alone? In fact, I don't think I've ever seen you with a baby in your arms. It was always obvious to us that you didn't like children. I just never wanted to have any of my own. After all, it's my body, I continued smugly. Yes, it is. And Terry respected that, although I'm sure you told him that after the wedding. She sighed and set her cup aside. I wish you'd respected it as much, don't you? That's not true. I respected and loved him. I protested, but it sounded weak, even to me. Really? If that's true, I'd hate to see what you'd do if you didn't love him, Janice remarked. In fact, I can't help but notice how stoic you are about his suicide. That hit a nerve. What was I supposed to do? I'm the one left alone. I'm the one with responsibilities. I have to pick up the pieces and move on. If I break, it won't change anything, I said, feeling more than annoyed. No, it won't change it, but it might help you deal with his death. But you've never shown much emotion, have you? As far as I can remember, you didn't shed a tear when your father died. A long, awkward pause followed. Then Janice said quietly, looking me in the eye, "That means you're either holding it all in and are a potential time bomb, or you're a functional psychopath and dangerous." Before I could respond, she added, "Or you're just numb, deeply numb for whatever reason, and sooner or later it's going to come out. Emotions have never been my strong suit." "You know that," I replied softly, sternly pushing away the uncomfortable feelings. "Yeah, I know. So what now?" asked Janice after a few more minutes of awkward silence. "I guess I have no choice but to move on, do I?" I asked, letting the bitterness seep into my tone. "No, you don't have a choice," Janice replied, "but Richard and I will be there for you if you need us. We may not approve of your choice, but you are our family, and we still care about you. Thank you, Janice." "I appreciate it," I replied, suddenly feeling genuinely grateful that my older sister still had some feelings for me, even if she didn't think I deserved them. We spent the next hour making small talk, which helped me ignore all the anxiety and feel a little better. "Richard's on his way home," Janice said, glancing at the text message that had just popped up on her phone. "Would you like to stay for dinner? I'm afraid it'll just be leftovers." "Your leftovers are always good," I told her. "I'd love to stay." We had a nice dinner and talked about everything but the 800-pound gorilla in the room, which was fine with me. Richard wasn't as talkative as usual, but at least he showed some mild empathy. When he first entered the house, he nodded at me and cast a quick glance at Janice. They exchanged a quick series of barely perceptible nods, fleeting eyebrow raises, and almost imperceptible shrugs. Deep, married communication. I looked away to hide my expression and wondered when Terry and I had lost it and buried it deeply. Silly musings wouldn't get my money back or pay the bills. We moved on to the main course, lasagna. Janice was so used to cooking for the whole family that she always made way more than they could eat. Then she brought out an apple pie that she had baked herself. I had always enjoyed her pies, so I graciously accepted a healthy slice. We ended the evening with a small glass of wine and light conversation. Realizing it was time for me to leave, I thanked Janice for the treat and headed for the door. Janice stopped me and put her arm around my shoulders. "We really love you, Helen," she whispered, hugging me tightly. "Thank you," I whispered, caught off guard. "I love you too. If you need anything, just give me a call," Richard added quietly. "Thanks," I told him. We said our goodbyes and drove back to the hotel. Back in my room, I turned on the TV for background noise, changed into my nightgown, and plopped down on the bed. My eyes were fixed on the TV, but in my head I was reviewing my conversation with Janice. As I pondered her words, I realized that she was right. About everything. Was I really as indifferent and unemotional a selfish bitch as she had made me out to be? "Yes," I heard Terry answer, forcing myself to turn around in surprise at the voice. He was leaning against the wall and looking down at me. Why are you here?" I asked, perplexed. "It's simple." "You fell asleep," he said with a slight chuckle. Fell asleep? I didn't remember that. The last thing I remembered was hearing someone's conversation on the TV. When had I fallen asleep? "Are you going to haunt me in every dream?" I asked, with a cold feeling in my stomach. I wouldn't last long if I was afraid to fall asleep. "That's the plan," he replied with a crooked smile, made even more crooked by the exposed parts of his skull. "So you really think I'm an uncaring, emotionless, selfish bitch?" I replied, going on the offensive with more boldness than I actually felt. "Yes," Terry replied, not the least bit embarrassed. "It's obvious by your actions." "Take a look," he added, nodding toward the television. Surprised, I looked at the TV and saw what looked like a movie of my life, or at least parts of it. After a few minutes, I felt tears about to stream down my face as I watched scenes from our wedding. We both looked so young and vibrant, full of love and happiness. As the movie went on, I saw changes, mostly in me, I reluctantly admitted. Terry was always there for me, providing support when I needed it. He worked so hard in those early years so I could finish school. We saved money, often eating hamburgers that Terry cooked on an old gas stove in the tiny apartment we shared. We didn't have much in those days, but we didn't care. We had each other, and that was all that mattered. Right after graduation, I was hired, and things started to change. We saved enough money for a down payment on a house and bought it when the market was still good. We lived frugally for a few more years, but things gradually got better. As my career took off, I realized that the kids were only holding me back. I tried to turn away and couldn't. I was told right to my face how self-centered I had become. Over time, I stopped noticing Terry's work, brushed aside his worries and concerns. And as for his personal dreams and needs, I stopped listening. From the beginning, I didn't really want to get pregnant, but I kept it from Terry. It was a conscious decision on my part. I could see it in my face and remembered the logic behind it well. When he started talking about kids, I kept putting it off, using my career as an excuse. Yeah, and that. You should have been honest from the beginning that you didn't want kids, Terry said from somewhere out of the corner of his eye in such an emotionless tone that gave me goosebumps. You knew I wanted kids, he growled as we watched the movie. I'm sorry, I stammered as the movie went on. As my married life unfolded before my eyes, I could almost see a real wall growing between us brick by brick over time. Terry was always supportive of me, putting my desires before his own. At the same time, I could see that I was losing respect for him. When I looked at my bank statement and saw that one of my deposits exceeded his entire monthly salary, everything went to shit. He was making good money, but I was making more. The fact that he and I were living better on both of our salaries, not just mine, didn't matter to me. What was mine, and what was his was mine. That was the motto I lived by. By this time, it was clear that I was the dominant position in our marriage. Although Terry resented this, and I could see now how much he resented it, he continued to silently submit to my wishes. And he was committed to our marriage, to me. On the 12th anniversary of our marriage, I saw that he realized he could live a decent life with his own money. But he realized that divorce was an admission of defeat, and so he didn't want to upset the delicate balance in our relationship. And me? Well, let's just say I reveled in my seniority in the marriage. That's probably one of the reasons I started hitting on Ray. By the time the physical affair began, I realized I didn't have an ounce of respect left for my husband. Yes, that's right, Terry grumbled. When I realized it was a belated response to my apology, where was this Terry when I needed him? Maybe if he'd been rude to me before I left last Friday, I wouldn't have done what I did. Last Friday. Had it really only been 3 days? It seemed to me that much more time had passed. The next thing I knew, the alarm clock started beeping. I rolled over onto my back and turned it off. I looked with cloudy eyes at the wall where Terry was standing, but he wasn't there. Was it just a dream? Or was it something else? Was Terry right, and was I going to be haunted all the time? I crawled out of bed, did my business, showered, and brushed my teeth. I almost didn't recognize the old woman's face in the mirror. I looked like shit, and I felt like shit. From the time I'd spent in bed last night, I should have felt rested, but my dead batteries were more energized. I packed up, went downstairs, had breakfast, and then checked out. The house smelled better than yesterday, but it still resembled a crypt. The bedroom resembled a refrigerator, and when I walked past the couch, it was like walking past an open freezer. At the thought of sitting on it, I shuddered even more. I had no idea what Terry would do. Would he be able to do anything other than fill my sleep with nightmares? Was that what I wanted to find out? I paced around the apartment, taking inventory of Terry's things. Then it hit me. I needed to talk to Jerry Smith, a certified estate planner at our firm. I realized he'd probably tear me apart for letting the bank know about Terry's death, but I wasn't too concerned. I kept wondering when you'd call, he said, picking up the phone. I wondered briefly what he could possibly know about my situation, other than the fact that Terry was dead. I decided that asking was a bad move, and tried to keep my words and tones strictly businesslike. I told him what I had already done, and he assured me that everything would be taken care of. It was a perk of working at a law firm, and it would take a huge burden off of me. Thanks, Jerry. I appreciate it, I told him. I tried to sound sincere, but I'm sure I looked exhausted. No problem. It's what I get the big bucks for. If you can, get all your financial stuff together and bring it to me this afternoon. Do you think you can do that? Asked Jerry. Yes, I'll be there. 3 o'clock will do, replied Di, glancing at my watch. Works for me, said Jerry. I spent the rest of the morning gathering everything I needed, including a copy of Terry's will. I was a little creepy as I felt occasional gusts of cold air, even though no doors or windows were open. More than once I heard creaks as if someone was walking up and down the stairs. I chalked it up to nerves and continued onward until I'd packed everything I needed. A nice hot shower helped calm me down, and I left the house, changing into something less casual than jeans, but more casual than the business suits I usually wore. When I got to the office, I noticed everyone was looking at me cheerfully, then quickly looking away when I returned their gaze. It was obvious that they knew what Ray and I had been doing over the weekend. I felt my cheeks start to blush and hurriedly continued. Are you going to work more casually these days, Helen? Asked Wilson behind my back. I turned and saw that he was smiling, but the smile didn't seem to touch his eyes, which were restrained. I came to see Jerry about Terry's latest arrangements. I told him a little defensively. It's the most sensible thing you've done since Friday, he replied in an even tone. When you're done, would you mind coming into my office for a few minutes? Sure, I said, suddenly nervous about the state of my career. He was an old-fashioned gentleman, but he was the managing partner, and I recognized an order when I heard one. I finally reached Jerry's office, and he waved me over with a somewhat forced smile. We shook hands, and he offered me a cup of coffee as I sat down. Taking a sip, I pulled out my papers and held them out to him. We discussed things while he looked over what I gave him. Everything seems to be in order, Jerry said as he looked over my papers. I'll take care of everything from here. Is there anything else you need? Yes, I need to amend my will and trust, I told him. That makes sense, he said, pulling out my folder. I see that your husband has been named as a beneficiary. He's also listed as executor on your trust and your medical power of attorney. I'd like my sister Janice Hopkins to be named instead, I told him, and I want to give her power of attorney just in case. Very well. Just write it all in pencil and initial it. You know what to do. I'll make the changes. It won't take more than a day or so. Thanks, Jerry, I said before we ended our meeting. From there, I walked to Wilson's office. His secretary waved me in, and I couldn't help but notice the caustic look she bestowed upon me, as if I were a large dung beetle spreading its nuisance around the office in front of me. Helen, come inside, have a seat, Wilson said with a pleasant smile. How are you holding up? He asked when I sat down. It's been an A challenge, I replied cautiously. It sounds like you didn't sleep very well, Wilson remarked with concern on his face. It wasn't easy, I admitted. I hesitated to tell him about my dreams, if they were dreams. Wilson nodded before continuing. You're probably wondering why I asked to meet with you, he said. The senior partners aren't happy. Your husband has sent out emails to virtually everyone in the firm, and it's probably hopelessly optimistic to assume that this information hasn't leaked outside the firm by now, or won't soon. Needless to say, your credibility, shall we say personal and professional, has taken a hit. The only reason you haven't been fired is the fact that up until now, your record with this firm over the past 20 years has been exemplary. I considered Wilson's words and, more importantly, what he didn't say, but his look practically screamed and made a decision I hoped I wouldn't regret. Maybe I should tender my resignation, I said quietly, feeling knots in my stomach. Wilson said nothing for a few moments, pretending to mull over my suggestion. At least he had the decency not to jump on it right away. He nodded before answering, and I realized I'd gotten his body language right. As much as I'd like to lose you, Helen, I think it's for the best. However, given your length of service, your spotless record up until this weekend, and your willingness to take responsibility for your actions, I think the partners will agree to keep you on the payroll until the end of the month. That will give you time to deal with your husband's latest endeavors. No pun intended, of course. We'll put together a reasonable severance package that I think you can live with. You're smart, driven, and one of the best lawyers I've seen. I'm sure you'll get back on your feet. Thank you, Mr. Bledsoe. I appreciate it, I said quietly. It felt a little surreal, like I was reading lines for a radio melodrama. Sure, you might want to consider a change of scenery. Have you ever been to Boise? He asked in a completely neutral tone. In Boise? In Idaho? No, I haven't. Why? I asked, shocked by what I took as a sudden and unexpected turn in the conversation. An old high school buddy of mine is the managing partner of one of the firms there. He's looking for someone with your experience and abilities. If you like, I can give him your name. Sure, I replied with some hesitation. Good, great. I'll let him know. This is card, Wilson said, holding out the card to me. I glanced at it briefly and then put it in my purse. Sure, I could call Ray, but part of me wanted to never have anything to do with him again. I fought down my morbid curiosity. Can I ask about Ray? What's going to happen to him? He looked at me very thoughtfully for an awkwardly long moment, and then seemed to come to a decision. As you know, Helen, I can't go into details, privacy considerations, and so on. Let's just say that Mr. Bland has exhausted any stores of goodwill he may have had left from the senior partners. You may not know this, but you're not the first associate whose marriage he's ruined. That's why he was transferred to this office after his divorce. His ex-wife caught him with a paralegal. It was an acrimonious divorce, to say the least. He lowered his gaze and made a note on the boulevard. The lawsuit required us to keep him employed and pay a rather generous alimony. He muttered the last very quietly as if he was pondering, and it leaked out. I didn't know any of that, I said quietly, stunned. I admitted to myself that I was well aware of his reputation, which was why I'd chosen him for my first extramarital adventure, but not about that. Damn it. Well, I have a meeting to attend. I'm truly sorry for your loss, Helen, and I'm sure I'll see you again before you leave, Wilson said as he stood up, signaling to me that the meeting was over. I'll be back, I said. I still have some papers to sign. Thank you for everything, I added as we shook hands. Fighting back tears, I hurried out of the office, avoiding socializing with the others who I was sure were watching me leave. Moving into my car, I burst into tears. I loved this job and loved working with everyone here. Worse, I had worked here for over 2 decades. The thought of leaving to Boise made me feel like I was exiled to Siberia for my sins. Eventually, I calmed down enough to drive, but it still wasn't easy because the tears wouldn't stop. Because of my blurred vision, I almost got into a couple of accidents. I finally made it home and sat on the couch, burying my face in my hands and sobbing uncontrollably over the loss of my favorite job. I cried until I heard a sharp knock in the living room. Surprised, I looked around, not realizing what had happened. And then I saw this. A 5x7 framed photo from our wedding was lying face down on the nightstand where it had been for years. Goosebumps ran through my body. Startled, I picked up the photograph and saw that the glass was shattered as if it had been hit with a fist. The sensation was like a storm cloud passing over my head. I almost threw up when I realized how horribly my gut twisted that I was crying more over the loss of my job than the loss of my husband. Frightened, I threw the shattered photo on the couch and looked around to see if anything else had moved. I couldn't explain how that picture had suddenly fallen on my face and with such force. Then it hit me. It had to be Terry's doing. In an instant, I went from frightened to angry, from horror to rage. "Leave me one!" I screamed into the empty room. "You're dying! Go away! Stop messing with me, damn it!" Suddenly, the temperature dropped and the room became darker. I almost expected to see objects flying off the walls, and I thought I heard maniacal laughter coming from the stairs. There was no way in hell I could be alone in this house. I grabbed my phone and called Janice in a frenzy. "Hey, sis, what's up?" she answered in a cheerful voice. "Not great. Can I spend the night with you guys? Please?" I pleaded, my voice shaking. Her tone instantly turned concerned. "Of course you can. We'll have the guest room ready for you. Is everything okay?" she asked. "No, it's not all right. I'll tell you when I get there." "Thank you," said I. We finished talking and I ran upstairs to pack my overnight bag. Again, I threw things into my bag as fast as I could, not caring to pack them neatly. I had to get out of this place before Terry did something else. I made my way down the stairs, holding tightly to the banister with my hand so I wouldn't fall. I was sure Terry would push me down the stairs if I wasn't careful. Then I ran to the garage, threw my stuff in the car, and drove away. If I lived in a cheap horror movie, the burning streaks of rubber on the pavement would be dragging behind me. Janice met me at the door and I fell into her arms, sobbing. She wrapped her arms around me and tried to comfort me as best she could. Finally, she got me to sit on the couch and calm down enough to speak. "Good God, sis. What happened? Did someone break into your house or something?" "It's much worse than that," I sighed hopelessly. It's Terry. Terry? He's dead. What can he do? Asked Janice, looking at me strangely. I told my sister about what I had experienced the past 2 nights and what had happened when I got back to the house. He listened silently as I practically babbled my story. He's trying to drive me crazy. I know he is. I sobbed in conclusion. Honey, you've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe you just need to relax and get a good night's sleep, Janice said, trying to calm me down. No, you don't understand. He wrote in his suicide note that he hoped I would see his face every time I closed my eyes. And I did see it. I haven't been able to sleep properly since Sunday, and now this. On top of that, I quit my job so I wouldn't get fired. I sobbed again. Part of me would say that my body wasn't capable of crying out another drop, but I was clearly wrong again. Oh no. What are you going to do with the house and with all your bills? I have the money and insurance will take care of the mortgage. I'm working until the end of the month and I've been promised severance pay. But I can't stay any longer in this place. You don't understand. Terry hates me. He'll kill me if I stay there. The tough lawyer was half a step away from hysteria. Come on, sis. You're a reasonable person. That's a little extreme, don't you think? How can a dead person hurt you or kill you? Asked Janice judiciously. I realized she was trying to convince me of my common sense, but she wasn't experiencing what I was experiencing. But you weren't there, I protested. No, I wasn't. I'll tell you what. Let me take your things upstairs, and then I'll make you a cup of hot chamomile tea and a grilled cheese sandwich. That should help you calm down, and then we can talk, okay? Okay, I said, suddenly feeling like a scared schoolgirl trying to hide from the monster under the bed. Say Janice carried my things upstairs and then went to the kitchen where she made 2 cups of tea and 2 grilled cheese sandwiches. She brought them on a tray to the front room and sat down with me. I sipped the tea, which was flavored with honey. Then I took a bite from the sandwich, which I thought was very tasty. I had a wonderful memory of our childhood. After a few moments, I began to relax and felt much better. Are you feeling better now? Asked Janice in a soothing tone. Yes, much, I replied with a deep and grateful sigh. Thank you. You're welcome. Have you told anyone else about meeting Terry? No, are you kidding? I'd be institutionalized. Not necessarily. You've been through a lot in the last few days. Meeting Terry must have come as a shock to you. Maybe you should take a few days and get your mind off everything. I can talk to Richard and see if he'd be willing to let you stay at the lake house. A few days in the country might do you good, Janice suggested. You may be right. Wilson said I need to get away too. He suggested I go to Boise. Boise? What's in Boise? Asked Janice, shocked, surprised, and a little amused. A friend of his is the managing partner of a law firm there. Apparently he needs a good lawyer, I replied. Are you going to invite him? Janice asked. Ask Janice. Ask Janice. I don't. I suppose I should at least call him, but I'd hate to leave here. You and Richard are the only family I have right now. I took another sip of tea before continuing. By the way, I changed my will and trust. You are now my sole beneficiary and executor of the trust. I've also given you power of attorney in case anything happens to me. I hope you don't mind. No, of course not, Janice said, but you're a young woman. I suspect you'll be around for a long time to come. I hope so. Still, I like to be prepared, I said. We ate and drank in silence for a couple minutes. I really messed up, didn't I? In almost a whisper, I asked, You haven't exactly been helping your case lately? Janice admitted diplomatically. I guess I just wanted to have my cake and eat it too, I remarked wryly. And look what it cost you, Janice said quietly. She didn't need to say it. I already knew what my greedy lust had cost me. My husband of 24 years is dead. My career is almost over and I can't even get a good night's sleep. All because I'd heard the juicy office gossip among my single and divorced co-workers and convinced myself that I simply must spend time with Ray Bland. Yeah, I sighed sadly. But it's too late to cry over spilled milk like Mom used to tell us. You need to pull yourself together, sis. You're right, I told her. Yeah, maybe I'll take you up on your offer and get my mind right again. Right now, I just need to get some sleep. Suddenly, I broke out into a huge yawn that made my jaw ache. The tea had done its job, and I felt my eyelids getting heavy fast. Let's carry you upstairs, Janice said, before you doze off here on the couch. She helped me up and led me up the stairs to their guest room. The blankets were already down, and I barely had time to slip into my nightgown. Janice pulled the covers over me, after which I collapsed under the blanket. "Thank you," I mumbled to my older sister, "for everything." Janice smiled and kissed my forehead. "You're welcome. Now get some sleep." She closed the door as she left, and I dozed off. "So you thought you could get away from me by running to your sister's house?" I heard Terry's sarcastic voice. When I looked around, I saw that the bedroom was filled with a thick gray mist that looked like a curling cloud. Terry stepped out of the closet, skull fragments sprinkled on top of him. "Why are you here? Why can't you leave me alone?" I asked in desperation. "Leave you alone? Ha! I'll never leave you alone, bitch!" Terry growled. His disfigured face contorted into an even uglier mask. "You were the one in the house, weren't you?" I asked. "With the picture." "Yes, it took me a lot of effort to make it, but now that I know I can do it, I'll do it more often." Terry grinned. "Please, can't you just leave me alone? You're dead. You have to move on," I pleaded. "Yes, I am dead, but whose fault is that, huh?" "You pulled the trigger." "I didn't make you do it," I replied. "Yeah, I pulled the trigger. It was either me or your boyfriend, but he was too much of a coward to get out of the car." Terry snapped back. "You were going to destroy Ray?" I was horrified. My Terry, my soft, pliable, compliant Terry, had turned into a potential murderer. "You would destroy me?" I thought about it seriously, but it would have been too quick. It wasn't supposed to be like that. His eyes flashed crimson, and I held back a cry. "How is it supposed to be, sweetie?" he shouted, and I flinched. "To go along with your cuckolds and turn into a lowlife who doesn't command the slightest respect. Slip away, leaving divorce papers behind so your law firm can draw and quarter me in the public square. Drop everything in sight, run away, and spend my life dodging every private investigator you can afford. Burn the house down and spend years in prison as Bubba's bitch." I should have immediately discussed all my wonderful options with my family and friends. Oh, wait. I had no family, and I was spending all my energy being a good husband, and I had coworkers, but no good friends except my best friend, which should have been you. Your lawyering left me with no options, so I chose the one option you didn't count on, but which still left me with a modicum of self-respect and some opportunity for revenge. So, honey, I pulled the trigger because it was the only option I had, and now my blood is on your hands. Look. I looked at my hands and saw that they were covered in a dark red blood, thick drops falling between my fingers and onto Janice's bedspread. I recoiled at the sight. "You may not be able to see her in the light of day, but she's still there, and nothing can ever get rid of it," Terry added. He staggered back, and I heard the gnashing of his teeth. More pieces of the shattered head flew free, but disappeared before they hit the floor. In a hoarse, agonizing whisper, he added, "And I can't go on living. I have what is called unfinished business. I can't move on up or down until that business is completed." He pulled himself together and really gloomed, and I almost shrieked. "By the way, you never answered my question. Was your little hookup with Bland worth it all? Not only did you lose me, but you don't have that lucrative job anymore. And I know how much it meant to you, more than it did to me at any rate. Look, Terry, I'm really sorry about this. Do you understand? I shouldn't have done it. I've got it all figured out now. Go away. Leave me alone," I protested weakly. I was exhausted more than physically and hated the parts of me he was sticking his nose into. "I don't think you really get it," Terry replied, his tone softening a little. "You're right. You shouldn't have done that. In fact, you shouldn't have thought about it at all, but you still think you're entitled to whatever you want and to hell with everyone else. It's still all about you. And as for leaving you alone, that's not going to happen. Ever. Please, Terry, I'm begging you. I can't take it anymore," I cried, tears streaming down my face. "Well, you know how the saying goes? In one hand is desire, in the other is shit. Let's see which one fills up first. I wanted a faithful wife who would love me as much as I loved her. And how did that turn out, huh? Enjoy the rest of your pathetic life, bitch," Terry muttered, and then burst into uncontrollable laughter. He disappeared into the closet, and the fog drifted away with him as if sucked up by some unknown mental vacuum cleaner. The blood on my hands and Janice's bedspread was gone. I fell back onto the pillow, tears streaming down my face. The next moment, I saw the sun shining through the window. I stood up, smelling the smell of bacon from downstairs, and shudderingly examined the bedspread. But there was no trace of blood. I went to the bathroom, did my morning ritual, got dressed, and went downstairs. I didn't feel much better, but at least I didn't feel worse. "Good morning," Richard said cheerfully, sitting at the table with his morning coffee. "Janice is almost done with breakfast. Why don't you have some coffee and sit down?" "Thanks, I guess I will," I said. I greeted Janice, who was putting bacon on a plate, took my coffee, tiredly wished for a double espresso, and returned to the table. "How did you sleep last night?" asked Richard worriedly, scrutinizing my haggard face. "Not too well," I admitted. "Did you see him again last night?" asked Janice, putting bacon and a plate of scrambled eggs on the table. I glanced at her, then looked at Richard. He didn't look shocked or incredulous, just concerned. For a moment I felt insulted since Janice had obviously shared my secrets with Richard. But then I accepted it. They were a real married couple, and they shouldn't have secrets if they had any at all. "Yeah," I replied. "Am I going crazy?" I asked Richard. "I'm a surgeon, not a psychiatrist," he replied with a slight smile. "But from what Janice has told me, I'd say you've been through a lot of psychological trauma and are suffering from a lot of stress on top of that because of Terry and your work." "You're probably right," I said quickly, not wanting to repeat my list of woes. "But if you want, I can talk to our staff psychiatrist at the hospital. I've heard she's very good at what she does. She might be able to help you." "I might agree," I said. We each grabbed some scrambled eggs and bacon and started eating. Janice was the best cook I'd ever known, since my mother and her scrambled eggs were delicious. "We also talked about you spending some time at the lake house. We don't mind you staying there for a few days if you want to. It will help you calm down a bit," Richard said. "That would be nice," I said. I knew from experience that the medical examiner probably wouldn't release Terry's body until the end of the week, and I still had 3 more weeks before I was officially dismissed. Maybe I thought a few days at the lake would do some good. Good. Then it settled. "I'll give you a key to the house before I hit the road. Can you handle driving?" asked Richard. "I can handle it," I replied, backing up my statement with a careless smile. We finished breakfast, and I helped Janice clear the table. Richard dug into his pocket and handed me the key to their cabin. I'd been there many times and knew the way. "Have a nice vacation," Richard said with a smile. "Thank you both for everything," I said as I hugged each of them. "My pleasure," Janice said. "And call if you need anything." Saying goodbye, I packed up my things and left. I thought about going into the house and grabbing a few more things, but decided against it. After yesterday, I didn't have the slightest desire to be in this place again. I stopped at Walmart and picked up a few things to get by and then hit the road again. I drove down a 2-lane road outside of town with the windows down and the radio on. The wind fluttering my hair kept me awake, and I was anticipating a few days of peace and serenity. I was only a half hour from the lake when it happened. "Nice day for a drive, isn't it?" I heard from the passenger seat. Stunned, I looked over and saw Terry sitting looking out the side window. I could clearly see the exit wound in his head, and sunlight was shining through the remains of his skull. "What are you doing here?" I almost shouted. "You fell asleep at the wheel, not very safe," Terry said, looking at me. "In fact, you better watch the road before you get to the intersection." Suddenly, my whole world shattered as a huge 18-wheeler truck slammed into my door. The impact sent the car spinning, and I was hit a second time by a truck traveling in the oncoming lane. My car ended up in the ditch, upside down, and I was sandwiched between the airbags that had deployed. "I'll see you later," Terry said before I passed out. Epilogue, 25 years later. "Hello, Mrs. Hopkins," the cheerful receptionist said as Janice signed in the guest book. "Hello, Amy," Janice replied. "How is Miss Baker doing today?" she asked April Callahan, the head nurse of Helen's unit, who appeared at the counter. Janice had made this trip every week for the past 25 years, and the nurse knew she was coming. It's all the same. She just sits in her wheelchair watching TV or looking out the window. The nights still seem to be the hardest for her. She insists she sees her dead husband in her dreams. April said sadly, Janice knew this, but she also knew that over the years Helen had managed to come to terms with it, and Terry's nightly visits no longer horrified her as much as they used to. "It's true that a strange thing happened the other day," April added as they walked down the hallway to Helen's room. "What exactly?" asked Janice. "If I hadn't seen it myself, I never would have believed it," April began. You know she has a picture of her with her husband that is on the dresser in her room. Yes, I know that picture. It was taken on their wedding day, Janice said with a note of nostalgic sadness. I was in her room feeding her lunch when the picture suddenly fell forward, face down. It just didn't fall. It fell with enough force to break the glass. April said, I almost jumped out of my skin when it happened. Maybe there was a draft? Janice suggested cautiously, feeling a chill on her skin. No, all the windows were closed and none of the fans were running. April replied definitively. That's odd, Janice said indifferently. She remembered the day Helen had said the same thing had happened at her house. It had been the day before the accident, after which she had slipped into a coma. She had recovered, but the damage from the accident had made her a quadriplegic. There was no way Helen was going to make it, and April was with her when it happened. She complained several times about something moving in her room, but I always thought it was someone on the staff moving things around while cleaning. I've never observed it myself. But the strangest thing was Helen's reaction. April continued, Oh? Asked Janice. Yes, she just smiled, looked at me and said, He's still mad at me. Does that make sense to you? Asked April. Oddly enough, it does, replied Janice with a fleeting, sad smile. I'll tell you about it someday. I can't wait to hear the story, April replied. Anyway, I have to make my rounds, but I know the front desk wants to talk to you about her benefits before you leave. I'll talk to you later. Okay, Janice said. She reached her sister's room and looked at the frail, 71-year-old woman sitting in her wheelchair, staring out the window. She remembered the day of the accident as if it were yesterday. Helen was on her way to the lake house when she was hit by an 18-wheeler truck and then another truck traveling in the opposite direction. According to the police report, Helen apparently fell asleep at the wheel and ran a red light. Officers said Helen had to be extracted from the car using the jaws of life and was lucky to be alive as the cab slowly filled with water from the blocked ditch, and the unconscious Helen just avoided drowning. She and Rich blamed themselves for a long time, knowing she was so tired they should have driven her to the cabin. The police report clearly stated that it was her own fault for not stopping at the traffic light, so the trucking company was beyond suspicion. Fortunately, she was still enrolled in her law firm's health plan, which covered her hospital expenses. But the benefits available to her didn't cover all of her long-term care costs, and Janice, now acting under Helen's power of attorney, used all of her sister's funds, including her 401k and Terry's 401k, as well as the insurance Helen had gotten from Terry's firm. Janice also sold Helen's home after paying off the mortgage and used most of the proceeds from the sale to cover her sister's medical and final expenses. Helen was now covered by Medicare, but she still had to pay for medications such as prescriptions. Medical expenses over the past 25 years had almost eaten up what was left of Helen's funds. She realized that if her sister lived much longer, she would likely go to a less comfortable nursing home. Look what I brought you, Janice said, pulling a new Afghan out of a large bag. I just finished it yesterday. It looked so cute, Helen squeaked. Thank you. I thought it would keep you warm at night. I'm sure it will, Helen said, and looked out the window again. Can you keep a secret? She asked. Of course, Janice replied. That weekend I spent with Ray, I haven't even told Terry yet, but I've already come to the conclusion that it wasn't worth the cost, Helen said, as a single silver tear rolled down her face. The temperature in the room dropped a few degrees, and the heavy hospital bed rattled quietly. Janice looked fearfully at the bed and then back at her sister. I think you already know, dear, Janice said quietly. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.